So, uh, yeah, things are pretty informal on my podcast. It's usually really edited after the fact. And what I've been doing lately as well is also putting the full recording online for the full.
Oh, okay, cool.
So like people, if they don't want the edited version and they want to hear the back and forth, they can listen to it that way.
Cool,
So
man.
first, would love for you to just share, your name, who you are, your story, so that the audience can get all that info.
Yeah, sure, man. So Jesse Curry is the name. So originally from Harlan, Kentucky. Went to West Point and graduated in 2009. And following graduation, I commissioned into the Army as a aviation officer. So I flew Apache helicopters for about 7 years. And then in the middle of that, I did some work in the intelligence community as well for about 2 years. Following that, in 2016, had some back injuries and decided to go ahead and get out of the military, and found my way to my current role with a pharmaceutical company in manufacturing pharmaceuticals, where I do continuous improvement. Yeah, and personally, like I'm married, 10 years, got two crazy kids that keep me occupied when I'm not doing anything else, right? So I got a 9-year-old son, or soon to be 9-year-old son, and then a 4-year-old daughter. So
Got it.
that's pretty much us, man.
Cool. So that transition was sort of forced in a way, it sounds like, due to the back injuries. How was that experience, and was it challenging going through that?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. It definitely was more forced than I would have liked it to be. I hadn't made up my mind if I wanted to be career military yet or
Mm-hmm.
not. But so I herniated some disc in my back in my neck while in Afghanistan, and then fought through it for a long time, and then it kept flaring up. And then one part about being in aviation is you have to go through a lot of flight physicals, things like
Yeah.
that. And the flight doctors, for some reason, don't like it when you can't feel your feet all the time.
Yikes.
So the only reason that their fix would have been to have had some cages put in my back and in my neck.
Oof.
Yeah, and I was 28 years old. So this is I'm 33 now, but 28, 29 years old at the time, and I just wasn't ready to do that. So I got a second opinion on the outside, and
Mhm.
from a civilian doctor, and their determination was that the only reason I would do that extensive of a surgery was to fly.
Hmm.
And so I, had to make the decision of what was more important to me, my career in the military or my long-term health. So
Mhm.
I chose to go with the long-term health piece and got out, and had some minimally invasive surgeries that have helped out. But yeah, so it made it stressful. It definitely sped up my timeline. It was really quick from the time I made the decision that I was going to go that route to the time I went through what the Army calls a medical evaluation board,
Okay.
and was determined that I was going to go ahead and get out of the Army. The Army was downsizing at the time, so switching from one branch of the military to another really wasn't an option.
Hmm.
So I went ahead and got out and found my way here. But yeah, it definitely added stress on top of it,
Yeah.
because of such a compressed time frame. And you always think as you're going through that, and looking for your transition, that you want to go out and you're going to find like your dream job,
Yeah.
right? But then when you have a wife and kids and stuff, and it's like, hey, find something that works, and that's what I did. So
Okay.
yeah.
So you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like a lot of times as entrepreneurs and just as people in general, people often they tie their identity in with their career. And I know that is something that is the case in the military as well. And so during that time, where you were identifying as this person and you quickly had to transition out, was that identity, was that, your framework and paradigm of identity, was that challenged? And how did that influence your mental health through that transition? And just share that sort of aspect of the story.
Yeah, sure. So definitely, it is a huge part of my identity, being an officer in the military.
Mhm.
And one thing about the military that, I didn't realize how much I really enjoyed while I was doing it was, you know, knowing that you're making a difference. Like
Mhm.
there was no question, each day you were making a difference somehow, whether you were training folks to go do their mission, or you were doing the mission yourself.
Yeah.
And then, also, as an officer, as a captain, a company commander, I had, a group of civilians and green
Mm-hmm.
suiters, as we called them, of over 100 folks. And then immediately turn the switch, and within 2 weeks, I have 8 folks, and I'm working in a pharmaceutical plant, and I'm so far away from
Hmm.
the people I'm impacting.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, from a depression standpoint, anxiety definitely kicked in, because this isn't what you really wanted to have happen.
Yeah.
But then too, you start to see, after the anxiety kind of eases, as you find yourself seeping into depression. Um, Again, because you're making a difference, and there's no doubt when you're in the
Yeah.
military. And as soon as that switch was flipped, and it was flipped so quickly, it was, at the time, I didn't think I would struggle with it. And I had people tell me, like, hey, that's going to be a struggle. And I was like, oh yeah, whatever, it'll be easy.
Yeah.
But it was. And it started to manifest itself, and through anxiety and depression, for sure.
So you led a lot of people in the military, and I know you're an incredible leader, and you've got a lot of great philosophy and ideas about leadership. If you could share a little bit more about your leadership experience in the military and now as a civilian, I think that would help the audience gain some insight into your leadership experience.
Yeah, sure. So, one thing about going to West Point, is the first day that you're there, it's a leadership development academy, basically. I mean, it's a fishbowl. Everything you do is monitored, but at the same time, everything is an opportunity to learn. And while you're there, you don't really maybe understand it as much as when you look back on it. But from the day one, you're learning how to be a follower, and then you're learning how to lead, 1 to 2 people. Then you're learning how to lead 6 to 8 people, and then it gets bigger and bigger. And by the time you graduate, and you go through your initial schooling, for me was flight school for about 2 years, and then you show up at a unit, and you have a platoon of senior warrant officers who have been flying these machines, and crew chiefs that have been maintaining these machines for years, that you're in charge of in terms of leading them, but you're learning from them too. So it's a very humble way of leading, because you know that you don't necessarily know as much as they do,
For
but
sure.
you're still the person that's supposed to be leading. So I did my platoon leader time, had about 12 to 15 folks that I led at that point. And then following that, I found my way up to battalion staff as an intelligence officer prior to the deployment, where directly I had 5 to 8 people at any given time that I was in charge of. But then I was in charge of the intelligence briefs and all the things that are kind of combined within that, the overall intelligence picture in Afghanistan, in the region we were in, for a rotary wing task force of about 400 to 500 people.
Wow.
So yeah, definitely a challenge, because I was not an intel person. So learning and drinking from the fire hose is always fun, but with that came a lot of responsibility, right? Because you have to not only train the people that and get trained yourself, but then train your team. And that was one thing it was really rewarding for me, was training that team.
Yeah.
But then you are also responsible for the safety of the crews, because you're advising them on what threats are there at any given time. And in a lot of ways, it's a huge responsibility that, at times you forget about until it becomes very real. And then, but then following that, came back, went through some more schooling, and then found myself in company command and airfield command at Fort Rucker, Alabama. And that's when I had a mix of civilians and Army soldiers and warrant officers and officers. And that's my last role there. But so, yeah, I mean, kind of expanding upon that is just that, leadership is what I did, I guess, for the better part of 11 or 12 years. And then transitioning over to the civilian side, you notice that leadership is still important. It's definitely important,
For sure.
but the amount of emphasis placed on it from day one in the military, from your first day at West Point or your first day in basic training, whatever it is, path that you take, it is always about learning to be a leader. It's always about developing leaders, and it's always about the importance of leadership. But then you find yourself in a civilian world where there are other competing priorities, and there's business priorities that may trump leadership sometimes. And that was something I definitely struggled with, and really one of the things that got me to start kind of looking at, creating my own leadership development type route that I've been doing here.
For sure. So So during your 11 years, if I remember that number correctly, 11 years in the military, what would you say were some of the most important leadership lessons that you learned? And then with that, when you came back and you joined the civilian force, how did those skills and leadership qualities translate and become very beneficial for you and your team once you got, now as a civilian?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think one of the biggest lessons, or really two of the biggest lessons that I take from my time in the military is number one is humility. Like I mentioned before, a lot of times you're the leader on paper, but you have to understand that you're not the smartest person in the room and embrace that because you are ultimately responsible for the success of the team.
Hmm.
But without the team, you're not going to be successful,
Yeah.
right? So that's one of the biggest things I took away. And then the other thing was you never ask somebody who works for you or is, under you per se in the military, which I don't even like using that
Yeah.
terminology, but,
Yep.
that you may outrank, that you never ask them to do something that you wouldn't do yourself
Hmm.
because that if you're willing to make somebody do something that you don't have the courage or the competence to do yourself. Competence is one thing, right? You can
Hmm.
learn competence,
Yeah.
but character is another, and to me that's a character trait, and you never ask somebody to do something that you wouldn't do. And I've taken that well into what I do now is never ask somebody to do something you wouldn't do, but then also the biggest thing for me is I really am a huge believer in humility and just understanding that if you come in and you want to be the smartest person in the room, you are
Hmm.
missing out on so much talent that you could otherwise draw from on your team, that people probably know things and just are afraid to speak up if you're that arrogant leader that thinks you know everything. But
Yeah.
if you're willing to, humble yourself and say, hey, what do you think? And get the team's buy in. Because in the end, that's what it's about. Leadership's about a team, it's not about an individual.
For sure. Yeah. And I think that's really interesting and impactful for I think the listeners and for me. I've heard a lot about people talking about having a beginner's mindset when it comes to leading, and it's something that is hard to put into action.
Mhm.
Um, but at the same time, it's so valuable. You have these people on your team, and they're there for a reason. They have competencies, they have skills, they have ideas that you don't have. People don't think the same way, and it's hard to leverage that sometimes, though. So,
Yeah.
so do you have any recommendations for how people can develop their humility as leaders? Maybe actionable things that they can do to be more humble as leaders and to encourage their team to take more of a stake and develop those ideas and allow them to have more space to to impact the team.
Yeah. So one of the things that we did in the military a lot is if you're the commander per se, you're in charge. It was important that you put out something called a commander's intent. And that commander's intent it consisted of a purpose. Why are we doing what we're doing? Because that's often something we forget to tell people, right? Why are we doing what we're doing?
Hmm.
But then two, what are some key tasks that have to be done that like are non-negotiable for mission success?
Yeah.
And then what do you envision as the end state? And I know that sounds like a lot, but what do you envision as the end state? But if you can communicate those things, like what do I want to see at the end? What are some things that a few things that I definitely want to see done? Why are we doing it? And then you take a step back and take a step back consciously and allow those smart individuals on your team to come up with creative solutions
Hmm.
for how they're going to get there and really come at it with no bias. And it's okay then if they come back to you and maybe you don't agree or maybe you adjust things, but you should allow them to experiment with things because not only is it showing humility from you as a leader, but then two, you're allowing them to develop themselves.
Yeah.
If you come up with a solution all the time, yeah, maybe you were right 9 out of 10 times, but at the same time, then what happens when you're not there one day?
Hmm.
What's the team going to do? And as a leader, you're not going to be there every day. So, do you want the team to know how to think critically? Do you want the team to know how to have a clear end state in mind and then think creatively on how they get there and let them surprise you with their ingenuity? If you do that, you're going to train people to be leaders themselves. And I think when you do that, you create this self-led organization. And that's what the ultimate leadership's about, is when you can step away
Hmm.
and the team doesn't miss a hitch, then you've done your job.
Yeah.
Because that is like the ultimate kind of pinnacle for leadership, is when you can step away and nothing changes, then you've made your mark and you've developed that team.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's this interesting idea called the replaceable founder that I'm looking into
Okay.
as a new entrepreneur. How do you build a business that you can be a replaceable founder? You can be a leader to the point where your team, if you say, "I'm gone for a month," you can step away, and that team can take charge and do a great job. And I think that's you hit the nail on the head there with how to do that. To just switch gears a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
entrepreneurs that may not feel like they're the best leaders right now, or who are struggling as leaders because of maybe some mental health obstacles. So in that, as an entrepreneur who might be facing that, you not only are in charge of managing and developing your team, but you're also in charge of yourself and developing and managing yourself. And when it's hard to do that second thing of developing and managing yourself, it's kind of hard to do that for your team.
Mm.
So what are some struggles that you think entrepreneurs with mental health obstacles experience as leaders?
So that's a really good question, and I can definitely relate to that. One of the things that kind of for my mental health journey along the way is, as a part of my time in Afghanistan when I was an intelligence officer, we had a Black Hawk that got shot down, and as a part of that, there's plenty of blame to go around, right? But
Yeah.
I took a lot of that personally on my own shoulders, because it was my job to be the person that did the threat analysis. And even though I know I had mentioned this to leadership over and over, it was still determined we would go forward with the mission, right? And sometimes that's what you do.
Yeah.
And but then after 6 out of 7 people on the aircraft are deceased, then you start to really hold that against yourself. You start to guess a lot of the what ifs. And what that did to me, initially I thought, you know what, it'll be okay. And I didn't think about it. But then when I got back to the US after deployment and I was in a course and they brief us on this particular incident and it's listed as an intelligence failure, yeah, I took that to heart, because that was something then that caused a lot of anxiety and a lot of depression for me. And because of that, I what ifed everything.
Mm.
What if I'd have done this? What if I'd have done that? And it's very natural to do that.
Yeah.
But then what that did to me as a leader was it almost sent me into micromanaging mode,
Mm.
because then I wanted to make sure that I didn't miss anything.
Mm.
And it translated into my job, my last job in the military some, but then definitely when I got into the industry I'm in now, I found myself thinking, I've got to work countless hours because I got to make sure nothing gets dropped. Now, the
Yeah.
stake is a lot different in the industry I'm in now, but at the same time, once you've failed at that level and you feel that personal failure, that you take on yourself. And now, one thing that I've done to kind of get over that is that I have to also realize that the enemy gets a vote, right? So
Mm.
that's one thing we often say in the military, and you can't plan on what the enemies. They're not always going to comply with your maneuver graphics and what you think they're going to do. They're going to do what they're going to do. Um, and it's still very hard for me to this day, and I've struggled with that. But to kind of get back to what you were saying on how do you deal with that, is you have to be self-aware that you're allowing yourself to get to that level that you are almost micromanaging to the development of other people. And you also have to prioritize your development and your self-care, because personally for me it manifested, in 2017 I'd been out for 6-8 months, thought I was dealing with everything well, but then I was working 12, 14-hour days.
Mm.
I was working out, I was raising kids, I was doing everything else. And all of a sudden one night, I thought I was having a heart attack.
Mm.
and I found myself in the emergency room hooked up to EKGs
Wow.
and everything else. And come to find out, I wasn't giving my body enough rest. And I went into something called rhabdomyolysis, which basically your body tissue starts to break down and
Mm.
your kidneys can't keep up with it.
Mm.
And that was a wake up call for me, because at that point I realized that I have to take a step back and allow people to do things for me, and with me as a team,
Yeah.
so that therefore I can make sure that I take care of myself. Because one thing that we often forget about as leaders, whether it's your development or whether it's your mental health care, is you have to take time for you. Because if you don't take time for you, then especially when you're starting a team and you're not to that level yet where the team can self-manage, then the team will, ultimately feel the repercussions of being leaderless, because you won't be there, and
Mm.
especially as an entrepreneur. So it's just a watch out that, it happens, but you also have to realize, don't get sucked into the tactical near term, because that's what we tend to do is,
Mm-hmm.
that's what I tended to do, was every little thing had to be done and I had to make sure it was done correctly. Focus on the long term. What's critical that has to be done now? What's critical that you need your team to know now? And then what can wait, and make a training plan, you know,
Mm-hmm.
forecast things out, because you're not going to build your business in a month. You're not going to build your business in 2 months. You have to have a long-term plan for what that's going to look like in order to keep your, mental stability yourself, but then also in order to make sure you don't overwhelm your team.
Yeah. Man, that resonates so much with me right now, because just got a big new client that is making me scale quite quickly, to the point where, I put in some longer hours than I'd normally do not want to do,
Hmm.
trying to get everything onboarded as best as possible, while also hiring 4 new part-time people. And it's like, getting stuck on those little minute details that are urgent, but maybe not important.
Yep,
Um,
absolutely.
and I think that's something that I struggle with. And I think a lot of other entrepreneurs that lead struggle with, is what is important versus what is urgent. And it's something that I deal with every day, and it's a challenge. What about changing the conversation again slightly? Is, so now you're an entrepreneur, and you've got the leading thing down. Your team, they're full of people, people that experience things in their personal life, mental health obstacles, and those people, they have their career, but they're also individuals, like I said. So how do you go about making sure that you're looking out for the mental health of your team?
Hmm.
How can you be aware of when someone might be struggling, and how can you, as a leader, try to destigmatize mental health, and make sure that you're taking care of the folks that you lead?
Great questions. I think the first thing that you have to do as a leader is you have to take the time to get to know your people and get to know them on a personal level. Now, that doesn't mean you necessarily have to be best friends and whatnot with them, but you need to know them as a person first, right? And you need to know, what does their normal performance look like? You know, what is their normal demeanor when they come in each day? And then if you get to really know the person and you realize, number one, that, I completely object to the mentality that, hey, leave it at home, leave it at work type stuff, because we're all humans. And as much as we would like to say that we can turn a switch and I'm at work and this is work, Jesse, and then when I go home, this is home, it doesn't work that way.
Mm-hmm.
If you, the stress carries. So if you get to know people and you get to know what is it that motivates them, what are their goals, personal goals in life, what are their goals within the business, but then too is just watch their performance, and then you'll notice when things start to, necessarily slip. And when things start to slip, if you have that personal relationship established and that trust, which leadership is all about trust, then you can have that conversation of, hey, you know what, I noticed that you're struggling a little bit, or hey, I've noticed that, you're coming in and you look just tired, what's going on? and have that conversation with them. And then when you have that conversation, if you've had mental health issues yourself, which a lot of entrepreneur leaders have, share that, because a lot of times that's the stigma, is what are people going to think about me? And if you're their leader, if you're their boss per se, and you're telling them that, like, hey, I've been there, I'm here for you and I've been there, here's, I can help you, I can get you in touch with resources, we can make this better, then you're doing your job. And from a strictly from a leadership perspective, you take care of people, and then they're going to take care of your business. But if you take care of the business first at the detriment of your people, you're not going to get very far. So, placing the person first and in their personal welfare being the number one thing that you focus on. And then, and a lot of times that means, as a leader, to get to know people, you have to spend time. And then
Yeah.
that's where delegation becomes important, is you get competent people on your team. You don't need to do everything. I think it's Jeff Bezos who said that he tries to make 2 to 3 decisions a day.
Hmm.
That's it. And if he can do that and run Amazon, which of course he's got a huge team to support him, but
Yeah.
he started off in a garage. And if he can make 2 to 3 decisions a day and run that conglomerate that Amazon is, why do I need to make every decision?
Yeah. Dang. Wow. That's I feel like you're talking directly to me. But that's really powerful, because I think oftentimes it's hard as leaders. You're responsible for people, and you're responsible for their performance. You're responsible for, if you're an entrepreneur, you're responsible for the business, which then in turn is your livelihood,
Yep.
supporting your family. And it's hard to balance developing people and taking care of them as people and putting the time and energy into each individual person on your team, while also, trying to make sure that your business is going to stay alive and that you can support your family. Um,
Absolutely. That's a hard dynamic.
yeah. And so are there any other recommendations on, as a leader, either as a leader with mental health obstacles yourself, any other ideas on how you can make sure you're aware of those, make sure you're aware of when you're getting into a space that you need to take time, like you said, and take time for yourself, or from the flip side, any other ideas on employees who might be experiencing mental health obstacles and how to navigate that situation?
Yeah. So personally, I think it's important that you know your body and that your body's going to tell you things. But then I think it's also important to have 2 to 3 people that you can really talk to. And they don't have to, a lot of times people, the stigma of, I don't want to go to a counselor. Maybe you need to, but then at the same time, sometimes a good friend is as good as a good counselor,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if you have a good friend that you can talk to and you can be honest with and can kind of be an accountability partner with you, they're going to see things as well. And if you let them know up front, and you're open with them of, hey, I've had these issues before, if you see me going in this direction, let me know. Because a lot of times we get the blinders on
Mm-hmm.
and we're going to go in that direction. And, a lot of times we lose our self-awareness, but sometimes you need those people. And, a great person, if you're married or in a relationship, is your spouse. How your spouse, girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever, is, making sure that they're willing to tell you too,
Yeah.
I know, how am I headed, am I headed in the wrong direction? Because they know you better than anybody else.
Yeah.
And then third, kind of going back to the employees, is, encourage them to also have somebody, right? Because you are busy, you are a boss, and you
Mm-hmm.
can't, and you're running a company, and you can't be there the entire time. But, encourage them, let them know that you have an open door policy, and really make that an open door policy and not
Yeah.
just a piece of paper. But then be seen and be out. And, leadership by walking around is underrated. Get out and walk around and be seen. And then that's how people are going to talk to you. But then also encourage them, hey, if you're experiencing something, have somebody to talk to. Because honestly, I'm a firm believer that, even though I work in the pharmaceutical industry, not everything is solved with a pill. right? So not saying that there's not the right time and place for that, because there definitely is.
Yeah.
But at the same time, a lot of things can be worked through counseling or through talking it out with a good friend. So
Yeah.
I'm a huge believer of having accountability partners and, your spouse or whoever it is to lean on you and tell you when you're going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And during what you were saying there with the walking around, I feel like that would be very powerful for someone like me. I manage a remote team.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you recommend or any strategies there on folks that are, there's a digital age now, and yeah, I have currently six, I employ military spouse writers. So 6 military spouses all across the country that work on their own time. So
Mm-hmm.
for someone that manages a remote team, what do you recommend there?
Yeah. So first off, thank you for doing that. Hiring military spouses. I think that's something that's awesome. Um, but then secondly is, yeah, you can't walk around, but create a relationship to where you can call at
Hmm.
any time, right? And it doesn't, you can call and say, hey, not just checking in on, check in on the project, but then also say, so how are you doing? Right. So, and don't make it on a schedule, because a lot of times if people put it on a schedule, I'm a firm believer that you can put on a different face for the hour that is coming, as opposed to when a surprise call comes in. And if they get to know that, like, hey, Joey, my boss, he cares about me, because he's going to call me and he's going to ask me. And, I had a friend that whenever he first got into the military, he made a, I forgot what he called it, but it was a binder. Basically, it was about all the families and the
Hmm.
soldiers and their families. And he knew if they would let him know, right? But he knew the soldiers and their birthdays, their spouses.
Hmm.
He also would ask, when's your anniversary? When's your kids' birthdays? Things like that. And you would be surprised at how much that means to someone when you call out of the blue and say, hey, happy anniversary. And they're like, holy crap, like, how did you know? But like, and it's about showing, it's not about, being fake and trying to win people over. It's about showing them you really genuinely care,
Yeah.
because, it, a lot of people aren't going to do that. But if you take the time, and it's so worth it if you take the time up front, because people aren't going to care about you as a leader until you show them that you care about them. I think it was John Maxwell who said that, like, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Hmm.
And I'm a firm believer in that. So you have to take that extra time and that extra effort, and maybe you schedule it into your calendar, but they don't know it, because
Yeah.
it's all about organization. But and it doesn't have to be every week. It could be every other week or whatever it is. But you call and you check in on work. But then they get accustomed to where it's not only about work, it's about me. So you ask, well, how's your family? If they're a military spouse, so if their husband's deployed, hey, how are you holding up? I know
Hmm.
your husband is deployed, or your wife's deployed. Those things go a long way,
Yeah.
because I can tell you from having when I was deployed, having a spouse with a child, back in the U.S., like, people calling to check on her meant the world to her.
Hmm.
And I can only imagine it's the same for those incredible women that you're employing.
Yeah. Yeah. That's something that I've considered doing, but I haven't fully done. Is I think it would be valuable for any leader is to have some sort of, whether it's a notebook or a digital folder or something. It seems maybe not as genuine when you're writing it down, but you're writing it down because you care.
Yeah.
And if I'm able to write that down and act on those things of, you have 3 kids and your kids are these ages, and your kid last week was in the hospital. How's your kid doing? That was the case with one of the writers over the last 2 weeks. Is she had her young child that had a
Mm,
105-degree fever,
my goodness.
and so showing that you care was very valuable to her, and I could tell that she really appreciated that.
Yeah.
So to wrap up, would just love to give you the opportunity to share anything else about mental health and leadership for those entrepreneurs listening.
Yeah. So, yeah, first off, thanks for the opportunity to come on. This has been awesome. And I really enjoy kind of listening to your show. I keep up with it, and it's going really well. So thank you
Thanks.
for letting me come on. But I think the biggest thing is going back to the idea of separation. Is as a leader, you have to understand, and you can't let yourself fall into the trap of thinking that the person is only there to work, and that's the only way you can look at them. If you do that, you're ultimately either going to burn a person out, or you're not going to help that person reach the level of success and level of performance that they can. And being in touch with them and treating them as people, because leadership is a people business. It is not a business, it's a people business. And if you take care of the people, they're going to take care of you as a business leader, and showing them that you care through however many different ways that you can. You can never do that enough.
Mhm.
And I know at times people will say, well, that feels cheesy, but I mean, if it comes from the heart and you really care, which if you're a good leader, it does come from the heart and you're not doing it for the wrong reasons, then that's going to be felt by them. And in the end, you're going to have somebody who may be an employee for life for you,
Yeah.
because they know you care. You're going to have somebody who is proud to work for your organization, who puts forth better work for you, all because you care about them. So put the people first, realize you can't separate. And then when it comes to mental health, you know break that stigma about being the leader that's willing to talk about it. Because if you're the leader that, if somebody brings up mental health, and you think they're quote unquote soft, or they're doing it for the wrong reasons, well, you're not a leader at that point in my book. But secondly, is you have to make sure that you're the one talking about it. There's been multiple surveys I've seen here recently, and polls that have said American workers want their leaders to talk more about mental health. Do it. And if you do it as the leader in the organization, because they're always, you can't necessarily combat the stigma that may occur at a peer-to-peer level. You can definitely influence it, but you can let them know that there's not going to be any stigma from you.
Mhm.
And ultimately, you're the one, if you're the leader of the organization, that most likely they're trying to stay in the good grace of. And if you let them know that, like, hey, whatever's going on in your life, I'm here to support you in whatever way I can, and getting them the help and directing them in the right direction, I think that's going to pay huge dividends for you as a leader.
Yeah. That's great. That's great. So we'll end the official recording there, and then retroactive